He's the royal most people overlook, but not anymore. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, has broken decades of silence with a stunning ultimatum aimed squarely at Birgitte, Duchess of Gloucester. In a twist no one saw coming, the quiet cousin has become the fiercest opponent to Meghan Markle's whispered return to royal life, and he's naming names. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Richard remained an unshaken pillar of discretion, present, dependable, and unbothered by the seismic shifts reshaping the modern monarchy. But in recent weeks, something cracked. A private outburst once dismissed as the stress of age has now unraveled into a full-scale revelation, exposing the deep fractures splintering what remains of the traditionalist faction of the royal family. A growing wave of whispers confirm that Richard has not only voiced disapproval of Meghan's potential return, but directly approached King Charles with a singular demand: block her path back into the fold at all costs. The message wasn't veiled, it wasn't polite, it was raw, urgent, and blisteringly direct. Richard, the last of the overlooked dukes, stepped forward as the monarchy's reluctant avenger. Within the halls of the palace, the ripple effect was immediate. Advisors close to Charles were stunned. This wasn't about decorum anymore, it was a reckoning. Sources reveal that Richard's fury wasn't aimed solely at Meghan, but at someone far closer to home, Birgitte, the very woman who had, in quieter times, extended whispered reassurances to Meghan during the Duchess' most vulnerable early moments within the firm. Richard's rage was not born overnight. It had been simmering under layers of etiquette, buried beneath the weight of royal obligation. And now, it was erupting with precision. He accused Birgitte of shielding Meghan in the past, of nurturing a kind of rogue empathy that had, in his words, compromised the unity of the house. The revelation has torn open long-festering tensions between the so-called old blood and the Windsor wing attempting to modernize the monarchy's image. Richard's move, far from an isolated grievance, has emboldened a wave of senior but sidelined royals' names long absent from front pages who now see an opportunity to reclaim influence under the guise of preserving royal dignity. This is not a protest, it is a quiet insurrection. The Gloucesters, once thought to be fading into irrelevance, are repositioning themselves at the heart of the current crisis. No longer background figures, Richard and Birgitte have become the eye of the storm, willingly or not. The emotional stakes within the extended family are climbing. With each passing hour, the palace is learning that the conflict is no longer about Meghan alone. It's about legacy, blood, betrayal, and whether silence is a virtue or a weapon. And in this unfolding civil war of lineage and loyalty, Richard has chosen his battlefield and made his target devastatingly clear. But what role did Birgitte herself play in shielding or sabotaging Meghan's fragile ties to the crown? She's not flashy, not loud, but Birgitte, Duchess of Gloucester, has always known how to move pieces behind the scenes. And now royal aides are whispering that she used her quiet influence to bury Meghan's chances before the public even knew a reunion was being considered. For decades, Birgitte built her influence not through noise, but through precision. In a monarchy bloated with tabloid spectacle and public flair, she became the invisible architect of caution. Loyal to Queen Elizabeth's vision to the letter, Birgitte carried the weight of a quieter era, one that predated the firestorm of Harry and Meghan's departure. But now, that quietness is being recast as strategy. Sources deep inside the palace allege she personally intervened when whispers of Meghan's tentative return began circling behind closed doors. It wasn't confrontation, it was containment. She intercepted correspondence meant for the king, documents that allegedly outlined a soft roadmap for Meghan's reintegration into royal duties. Those letters never reached their destination. No one confronted her. No one needed to. That's the thing about Birgitte, she doesn't need a throne to be powerful. But her actions didn't stop with paper. In quiet corners of Clarence House and Sandringham, she began laying the groundwork to close the ranks. Her charm, so often described as composed and unaffected, became something else entirely. She began to lobby, subtly and deliberately, encouraging Queen Camilla and Princess Anne to consider the damage a Meghan return could inflict. Aides who once described Birgitte as harmlessly ceremonial now say she was the first to call Meghan's return a reputational threat. And it worked. The more she whispered, the more resistance spread, not as a storm, but a chill. Camilla reportedly shifted her tone, Anne grew more distant, and the circle around Charles began to tighten just as Meghan's camp tried to reopen the door. It's now Birgitte's loyalty doesn't bend toward reconciliation. Her allegiance lies with the old order, what existed before the Sussex schism, before the emotional pleas and televised grievances. For Birgitte, the monarchy doesn't survive on sentiment, it survives on structure, the traditions, the silences, the unspoken rules. Meghan's return, in Birgitte's view, threatens the very scaffolding holding that structure upright. And so she moved not with fury, but with finality. Yet the real sting isn't political, it's personal. Because once, when Meghan was still new to the firm and grasping for allies, it was Birgitte who reportedly extended a hand. She invited her to a quiet luncheon, offered gentle advice, even shared stories of navigating the shadowy corners of royal life. That kindness, fleeting as it was, makes her current stance feel all the more brutal. What changed? Was it Meghan's interview, her memoirs, or was it something deeper, an internal line Birgitte believes was crossed, never to be forgiven? Whatever the reason, her betrayal, if that's what it was, is not just strategic, it's symbolic. Birgitte was once the bridge between old and new. Now she is the wall. And as Richard's fury grows louder, it becomes evident that Birgitte's silent campaign may have triggered a civil war among royals once considered irrelevant. This isn't just about one duchess against another. It's about the palace's last defenders digging trenches in a battle for survival. Behind closed doors, it wasn't just about Meghan. It was about protecting a crumbling dynasty's last grip on order, and Richard had just detonated that fragile piece. Kensington Palace became the battlefield. According to leaks from within the royal inner circle, Richard summoned Birgitte for a private confrontation that spiraled into one of the most tense royal meetings in recent memory. Two aging royals, both once loyal servants of the crown, now standing on opposite ends of a royal war. What began as a quiet summons behind closed doors quickly turned into a confrontation neither of them would forget. The chosen location was deliberate, a discreet sitting room tucked away from public corridors, absent of servants, stripped of ceremonial grandeur. Only one senior aide was recorded entering before being dismissed, leaving the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester alone in a silence weighted by decades of unspoken tension. And then Richard erupted. His words weren't rehearsed. They were raw, emotional, sharpened by years of repressed fury. He accused Birgitte coldly, bluntly, of sabotaging the future of the monarchy not out of duty, but out of fear. Fear of change, fear of relevance fading, fear of the modern tide that Meghan represented. He alleged that her manoeuvres, once dressed in the guise of tradition, were in fact desperate attempts to protect her own dwindling stature within a monarchy that was shifting beneath their feet. But Birgitte, composed as ever, didn't flinch. She met Richard's accusations with an icy stare and a single warning, that he didn't understand what Meghan's return truly costs. Her voice, reportedly calm yet cutting, invoked a sense of threat without a raised tone. She reminded Richard of the chaos that had engulfed the family during Meghan and Harry's departure. The press battles, the transatlantic interviews, the fractures no PR machine could mend. Her implication was clear: inviting that chaos back into the palace wasn't an act of compassion, but of recklessness. Then, in a moment that stunned even Richard, Birgitte invoked the Queen's name. She referenced private conversations with Elizabeth II, suggesting that the late monarch had confided concerns about Meghan's long-term compatibility with royal life. It wasn't a command, Birgitte claimed, but it was certainly a caution, a subtle, final warning from a sovereign who had seen too many storms. The room fell silent after that. According to the aide stationed outside, Richard left the room visibly shaken, his usual steady gait replaced with something faltering, as if the weight of what had just unfolded had cracked something inside him. One witness described his face as washed with emotion, and though no one dared confirm it, there were rumours of tears. Birgitte, on the other hand, emerged later, silent and unreadable. No one knows what words she whispered to her driver before stepping into the car, but what became instantly clear in the days that followed was that the two had emerged from that confronter, torn with completely divergent visions for the monarchy's future. Richard, wounded but defiant, would not back down, and Birgitte, reinforced by her resolve, would not yield. And as the clash between Richard and Birgitte grew louder, someone else began quietly preparing for battle, Meghan herself. While the senior royals clashed, Meghan Markle was already moving. A trail of discreet emails, intercepted calls, and one explosive dossier revealed just how close Meghan came to returning and just how hard someone worked to stop her. Behind palace gates, while Richard and Birgitte played a silent game of legacy chess, Meghan had quietly set the first pieces of her own comeback in motion. What began as casual correspondence soon became a structured plan. At the centre of it all was a trusted advisor, unnamed, but with deep royal ties, tasked with drafting a soft re-entry blueprint. The intention wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, it was calculated. A step-by-step proposal built on rebuilding trust, focusing on controlled public engagements, carefully curated charitable appearances, and a complete overhaul of Meghan's press narrative. According to insiders, the plan was weeks, possibly days, from being submitted directly to King Charles, bypassing traditional communication routes that would have flagged the plan far earlier. But someone noticed. The leaks began with a single message. A trail of WhatsApp screenshots and voice memos surfaced, hinting that Meghan was not acting alone. One neighbour, Me emerged more than once, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Though no public alliance had ever been declared, several exchanges suggest Sophie may have been quietly advocating for Meghan's return, seeing it not as a scandalous reversal, but as a necessary reconciliation. If true, this would mean that Meghan had a royal insider feeding her just enough intelligence to tailor her moves without igniting alarm. And yet, the alarm eventually blared loudly. A palace staff member, allegedly with loyalty to Birgitte, discovered a fragment of the draft and elevated it within hours. What followed was a swift internal crackdown that few saw coming. The document, now referred to in hushed tones as the dossier of re-entry, was a masterpiece of strategy. It detailed how Meghan would navigate key events, avoid controversial topics, and slowly rebuild her image not just with the public, but with the family itself. It even included proposed collaborations with certain royals, appearances at children's hospitals, a potential mental health initiative under a new royal patronage. It was polished, professional, and deeply dangerous to those who viewed her return as betrayal. Once Birgitte caught wind of it, she moved instantly. She summoned allies, she whispered warnings. And then, in a twist no one anticipated, Richard intercepted a senior aide's report containing the plan's internal timeline. That discovery, intended for a quiet reading, was what pushed him over the edge. But beneath the strategies and counterattacks there was something raw, something human. A letter, handwritten by Meghan, addressed to an unnamed royal, its contents never released, but described by a staff member who caught a glimpse of its opening lines. A plea, filled with remorse, longing, and desperation. One final chance, she wrote. A chance to belong again, to undo the rupture, to step back into the world she once fled, not for fame, but for family. But by then the wheels were already spinning. Richard's rage was sharpening, Birgitte's defences were hardening, and Meghan's letter, beautiful as it was, may have arrived just moments too late. But this was no longer a quiet tug-of-war, because Birgitte wasn't the only one determined to block the Duchess's return. Deep inside the royal machinery, a cold and calculated operation was underway. Dubbed Operation Evergreen by insiders, it was a coordinated effort to permanently silence any talk of Meghan's return and its origins, point back to some of the monarchy's oldest allies. This wasn't panic, it was precision. As whispers of Meghan's re-entry strategy reached the upper echelons of the palace, a group of seasoned courtiers and senior royals activated a response forged in shadows and silence. Operation Evergreen was never announced. It didn't need to be. Its presence was felt in subtle disappearances, in meetings moved off the official record, in advisors suddenly on leave after months of loyal service. The operation began with legal consultations anno Nimus, sealed under privilege, exploring every possible clause and condition that could limit Meghan's reappearance under the royal banner. This wasn't about scandal management. This was a structural defense plan, a monarchy's immune response to what it perceived as a foreign agent attempting to re-enter the bloodstream. Key to this orchestration were two unexpected architects, Birgitte and Princess Alexandra. The pair, often underestimated due to their age and ceremonial roles, began holding a series of private discussions in estates far from London's watchful eyes. Their goal was clear: reactivate what insiders called the legacy protocols. These were not written policies but long-standing, unwritten rules designed to protect the crown from internal threats. They summoned those rules like ancestral weapons, and in doing so summoned loyalty. Birgitte, ever strategic, avoided public confrontation, but her network moved swiftly. Allies were warned. Staff were briefed under strict confidentiality. And then came Camilla, not at the front lines but unmistakably present. While she refused to sign any formal orders, her silence was interpreted as permission. Her absence from key meetings was deliberate, a way to maintain deniability while the gears turned in her favour. But then Richard, with his back already against the wall, made his move. His public challenge to Birgitte's influence and his alignment with Meghan's defenders exploded the quiet unity that Evergreen depended on. His actions risked unravelling months of secrecy and strategy. Suddenly the operation was in jeopardy, not because it failed, but because it was being seen. Legal threats began to circulate. Palace aides were summoned to private meetings and warned in careful, lawyer-approved language about the consequences of disclosing internal security measures. Loyalty pacts were renewed behind closed doors, and once friendly press contacts received discreet calls urging them to stay away from anything that even hinted at Meghan's resurgence. Still, for all their planning, Evergreen's architects had failed to anticipate the reaction overseas. Meghan and Harry's California-based team was reportedly stunned. They hadn't expected support from inside the palace, but they also hadn't expected such rapid, coordinated resistance. Advisors scrambled, press strategies were shelved, and communication channels went dark. It wasn't just a setback, it was a direct message from the heart of the monarchy: you will not return. And yet, beneath the smothering weight of Operation Evergreen, something unexpected stirred. A royal who had remained neutral for too long. A man who once chose silence, now stepping forward to speak. Yet, while Operation Evergreen crushed plans from the shadows, it couldn't erase the one factor no royal had prepared for: Prince Edward's shocking intervention. He's always been the quiet one. But now Prince Edward has shattered years of silence with a letter that stunned both Charles and Birgitte. In a powerful gesture of unity, he demanded that Meghan be allowed to speak and reopened the very door others fought to lock. For most of his royal life, Edward had been the dependable shadow, the unshakable presence who carried out his duties without noise or rebellion. Known for his diplomacy, his caution, and his devotion to the Queen, he was never expected to intervene in the bitter battles that had divided the family since Meghan's departure. But something shifted, whether it was the weight of watching the institution fracture from within, or the quiet strain he'd witnessed between his wife and the rest of the family. Edward reached a breaking point, and when he broke, he did so not with a public statement or a strategic leak, but with a letter. Handwritten, delivered in person by his private secretary to King Charles. A copy was also handed to Richard, whose name Edward had underlined twice. In that letter, Edward did not plead, he didn't bargain, he made a statement. He wrote that the crown had survived war, scandal, and exile, but it had never survived when fear dictated its decisions. Fear cannot dictate the legacy of the monarchy, he wrote, and silence will not protect it. His words struck like thunder through the palace walls. Charles was said to be visibly shaken while reading it. Birgitte, on the other hand, was reportedly furious. She viewed Edward's intervention not just as misguided, but as an act of betrayal, one that placed personal sentiment over institutional integrity. Allies of Birgitte moved swiftly to discredit the move, calling it an emotional overreach, but it was too late, because the letter leaked. Within 24 hours it had made its way to a journalist with deep palace ties. The moment it hit the press, the public response shifted. For the first time, a senior royal N.O.T. tainted by controversy had spoken in defense of Meghan, not for her popularity, but for her right to be heard. And the reaction was electric. Commentators praised Edward's courage. Public opinion, long frozen in division, began to thaw. On social media, the hashtag Edward Speaks trended globally. The monarchy, once criticized for its silence, was now being challenged from within by one of its most loyal sons. ND in the middle of it all stood Sophie. Her response was complex, caught between duty and devotion. For days, she reportedly said little, choosing instead to attend engagements with a calm face and an unreadable expression. But behind the scenes, she stood with Edward. She told aides that she respected his decision and believed the monarchy needed a voice of reason. The old guard saw it differently. They viewed Edward's letter as the first crack in the dam, and they weren't wrong, because while Charles reeled from the pressure and Birgitte tried to rebuild her walls, it was Richard who made the next move. One that would take the entire war into the one room where secrets were meant to stay buried. ND, just as Charles began to waver, it was Richard who took matters even further, bringing Meghan's name into a private Privy Council briefing. Hat was supposed to be a routine meeting, turned into a historic rupture. In front of stunned advisers, Richard invoked his royal privilege and named Birgitte as the primary architect behind Meghan's exclusion, shattering decades of silence and setting the room ablaze. The Privy Council had convened in its usual fashion with a carefully managed agenda and meticulously prepared talking points. It was meant to be uneventful. But Richard had come prepared with something no one saw coming. As the formalities drew to a close, he stood unprompted and, in a voice sharpened by fury and resolve, made a declaration that would haunt the monarchy for years to come. He named Birgitte, Duchess of Gloucester, as the central force working to block Meghan Markle's return to royal life. His words stunned the chamber. Gasps reportedly echoed through the oak-panelled room, not because the suspicion was new, but because someone had finally dared to say it aloud, in official company, on royal record. This wasn't rumour. This was accusation, deliberate and documented. Richard's voice didn't waver. He accused Birgitte of undermining the future of the monarchy, of choosing secrecy over unity, fear over evolution. He cited specific incidents, meetings she attended, memos she wrote, calls she made, and then, to seal the confrontation, he presented evidence, pages, archived memos from years ago, authored by Birgitte herself, in which she warned senior aides of radical modernizations and the irreparable damage of bending to media narratives. Her language was unfiltered, her intent unmistakable. She had not only opposed Meghan's return, she had planned for its obstruction. The silence in the room grew heavier with every word Richard read aloud. And yet Birgitte was nowhere to be seen. Her absence from the meeting now took on a sinister clarity. Advisers whispered among themselves, had she known what was coming? Had she been warned? Or had she simply refused to face the reckoning Richard had promised behind closed doors? Whatever the reason, her seat remained empty, and that emptiness said more than any prepared defense ever could. Charles, caught in the middle, sat motionless, his face unreadable, his hands folded, his silence deafening. For years he had relied on Birgitte's quiet loyalty, her ability to maintain order among the older ranks of the family. But now, that very loyalty had become a wedge splitting the monarchy down its most fragile fault line. What followed was a shift too subtle for headlines, but seismic within the walls of power. Senior advisers, once aligned with the traditionalists, began rethinking their allegiance. Some, quietly and cautiously, began leaning toward Richard's vision not out of passion, but out of pragmatism. They saw the tide turning. They saw that silence was no longer sustainable. And perhaps, most of all, they saw that the public was watching. Meghan's name had been spoken. Her exile had been framed not as consequence but as conspiracy. And now the crown, once master of discretion, stood fully exposed. And now, with the council divided, Meghan watching from afar, and the crown in limbo. Charles was forced into a decision no monarch ever wants to make. All eyes turn. Ned to Charles. Between Richard's fury, Birgitte's defiance, Edward's plea, and Meghan's silence, the king stood alone. And in the solitude of his private study, he faced a single impossible question: reconcile with the Duchess, or risk rupturing the monarchy from within. It was a decision no monarch could make without consequence. Charles, long seen as the cautious reformer, now found himself paralyzed between two ghosts, one of his mother's legacy and the other of the future he promised to build. Those close to him spoke of a man consumed by quiet torment, pacing in silence, redrafting speeches late into the night. One version welcomed Meghan back, framed in the language of unity, healing, and new beginnings. The other was firm, final, and absolute, severing ties, reinforcing tradition, and signalling the crown's unwillingness to bend. Neither speech satisfied him. Both would invite chaos. And time was running out. Behind closed doors, Charles reportedly summoned William and Catherine for a private conversation. The Prince and Princess of Wales were measured but clear. They warned of the public backlash, whichever path he chose. Welcoming Meghan might ignite fury among traditionalists, further emboldening the old guard and fracturing fragile alliances. But rejecting her outright could trigger a wave of sympathy, painting the monarchy as unyielding and archaic in a world already losing patience. Their counsel was not emotional, it was strategic. But it left Charles with no clear path forward. He was a man trapped in a chess match where every move ended in checkmate. Then came Birgitte. Her response, delivered not in outrage but in ice, was a simple phrase passed through a senior aide: "There are some doors best left closed." The message was unmistakable. It was not a plea, it was not a request, it was a warning. A final attempt to seal the cracks Richard had blasted open. Her words hung in the air like a threat veiled in civility, a reminder that reconciliation carried a cost Charles might not be prepared to pay. And still, his heart hesitated. Because behind the politics and pressure stood something more enduring: his mother's memory. Elizabeth II had once offered him private counsel about the family's long-term survival. In her final years, she had spoken candidly about the risks of rigidity, the dangers of pride disguised as tradition. Her words, scribbled in a personal journal Charles had reportedly kept sealed since her passing, now returned to haunt him. Legacy, she had said, was not just about preservation, it was about adaptation. But which version of adaptation could the monarchy survive? And then came the leak. In a stunning revelation, sources close to the palace confirmed that Charles had requested to speak to Meghan not through aides, not through intermediaries, but directly. The call had not yet happened. The response had not yet come. But the request itself was seismic. After months of whispers, power plays, and silence, the king reached out. And that gesture alone shifted the atmosphere. It wasn't a decision, but it was movement. It wasn't a command, but it was acknowledgement. Something was about to change. But before any decision could be made, the final twist came not from Charles, Richard, or even Meghan, but from Birgitte herself. In a devastating final twist, Birgitte has played her last card. A letter, locked away in the royal archives for nearly a decade, has surfaced, and its contents could derail everything. What did Queen Elizabeth really say about Meghan? And why did Birgitte risk everything to reveal it now? The revelation came not through a dramatic press leak or whispered corridor confession, but from a retired palace archivist who, in a confidential interview, confirmed what many had suspected, that Queen Elizabeth had written a private letter following the wedding of Harry and Meghan, a letter never intended for publication, addressed not to a person but to the institution itself, a sealed reflection, locked within the inner vaults of the royal archives. For years it had remained untouched, a relic from a more stable time. But now Birgitte had retrieved it, or rather she had invoked a clause reportedly tied to it, an instruction the Queen left behind, that the letter was to remain sealed, unless the institution itself stands in danger of losing its soul. Birgitte argued that moment had arrived. The contents, though not fully disclosed, have been described as chilling and heartbreaking. Ingli prescient. Queen Elizabeth, writing in her familiar, restrained tone, spoke of conflicted loyalty and unbearable fractures she feared would grow beyond repair. She referred to Meghan not by name, but as the new blood, a term both hopeful and haunting. There was no condemnation, no clear approval, just the quiet sorrow of a sovereign who had spent a lifetime holding together a family, watching it splinter under the weight of modern pressures. Birgitte, however, interpreted the letter as validation. In a bold move, she used the Queen's words to justify everything: her opposition, her silence, her refusal to bend. But Richard saw it differently. To him, Birgitte's unveiling of the letter was nothing short of sacrilege, a weaponization of Elizabeth's legacy for personal defense. He accused her of twisting the late monarch's reflective sorrow into a shield against change. His fury was volcanic. "You've taken her last wisdom," he reportedly said, "and turned it into a prison." And yet the damage had already been done. The council was reeling. Public speculation erupted. Royal watchers dissected every known detail of the letter, every line that had leaked, every phrase that could be interpreted one way or another. The monarchy had never felt more exposed or more unstable. Now the crown teeters on the edge of two fates: reinvention or implosion. One letter, unearthed at the 11th hour, had reset the board. The voices calling for unity now clash with those demanding preservation. Charles, already wavering, is left in an impossible position, caught between the truth of a mother's fears and the fallout of a cousin's ambition. Meghan remains silent, her fate now suspended in a storm that was once beyond her reach but now revolves entirely around her name. Edward retreats, Sophie watches, William waits, and Camilla offers nothing but studied detachment. All the while, Birgitte stands alone, cold, composed, but irrevocably altered. She has made her final move, and with one letter, one confrontation, and one final demand. The fate of the monarchy and Meghan's future hangs in the balance. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.